Okay, I want to welcome everybody. Some of you, welcome back. Some of you, welcome to the afternoon session. I'm Jim Henson, for those of you that weren't here this morning. I work at UT and direct the Texas Politics Project there. I'm happy to be hosting the afternoon panel here for an event that we're co-hosting with the Texas Tribune. So thanks to our friends at the Tribune, thanks to the staff of the Tribune and our staff from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. Without further ado, I want to get started because we have a big panel and a good panel, and knowing all of these people reasonably well, they're all going to have stuff to say. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly because I think if you're here, you pretty much know who they are. So immediately to my left is Elise Hugh Stiles of the Texas Tribune. Are you branding Hugh Stiles now? That's my legal name. Okay. That doesn't answer my question.
Should we brand it? There's a Twitter hashtag. Yes.
Okay, that solves that. Of the Texas Tribune, who many of you know, I'm sure. Fred Gromer Jeffers Jr. from the Dallas Morning News. The globally famous Harvey Kronberg from the Quorum Report. My good friend Ross Ramsey from the Texas Tribune and Texas Weekly, which I probably forgot to co-brand you last time we had you here. And somebody new to this show also, and I'm really happy that could make it this time, our friend Jay Root from the Associated Press. So thanks for coming, Jay. We're going to talk a lot today about what just happened, what's coming, and also, since we've got all these folks from the press, I want to talk a little bit about those things through the prism of media coverage and talk a little bit about the really rapidly changing terrain in which, upon which all of you guys operate, guys and gals. So, but let's start with probably not the most interesting thing now, but the thing that all of you spent a lot of time on in the lead up, and that is the governor's race. And I think we probably beat, yes, as Harvey yawns, we probably beat the result to death. And you yawn now, but you wrote a lot about it. So
we had a few words.
So the question is, let's talk about what we knew going into this and how much you knew versus how much got covered. Because certainly there was a sense going in, and Jay and I talked about this just a few days ago, that this race was supposed to be much closer than it turned out to be. Now, did we believe that all? Did we believe that all along or not?
I don't think.
Jump in there, Gromer.
I don't think we believed that. I think we knew Perry was unbeatable, and that it would take Sam Houston getting out of his grave probably to beat him in this cycle. And maybe the margin was in question, but I think everyone pretty much knew that Perry would win. And the question was, could White provide any coattails at all for Democrats on local down ballot races? And I think in most instances that answer was no. And I think that's the question that was answered on Election Day.
Well, we hear the mantra again and again that all politics is local, but what Tuesday night proved was that all politics is national. Ross has said over and over, too, that this narrative was set so early that we were sort of anxious for the governor's race to end by the time it got to this week, just because this narrative was what carried him through the primary against Kay Bailey Hutchison and Deborah Medina, and now, again, on general election night this week.
Harvey, you were yawning, but I seem to remember having a conversation with you in a certain megastore several months ago, really during the Kay Bailey Hutchison Perry race. This is my informed the Costco survey.
Well, 6 months ago, Perry looked like, well, actually a year ago, Perry looked like a deeply flawed candidate, and the conventional wisdom obviously was that he was in trouble with Kay Bailey Hutchison. Going into election night, even the Perry folks were saying 52 to 53%. He ended up with, I think, 56, 57%, right in between there. 54, was that the final? Oh, okay, then they were closer. That must have been an early vote.
He asked me not to sit next to
you. But I think it's always been, in both the primary and the general, Perry's ability to organize, use social media that flies below our radar, that makes it very, very difficult to measure, is just keeps getting better. But I will say that just the quality of the two campaigns, we hated getting press releases from the Perry campaign because they were the same thing pretty much every day. But the flip side was that every day seemed like a new beginning to the Bill White campaign. It was a new message.
They should have used that.
And I think about 3-4 weeks ago, we had been saying that we thought it was going to be a mid-single-digit race. 3 or 4 weeks ago, it just seemed like the White campaign, you could hear the stridency, the hysteria inside the campaign and the press releases as they finally discovered a message that might have worked 4 months ago. And so I think everybody started expanding the spread that they anticipated.
You get this really late flurry of brown envelopes from the campaigns that are in trouble. You know, they say, have you seen this about my opponent? And that seemed to really get busy in the last 2 or 3 weeks, particularly from the White campaign. I guess last 4 to 6 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks before early voting started. Perry underperformed the Republicans on the statewide ticket. White overperformed the Democrats on the statewide ticket by about 6 points in White's case, by about 5 points down in Perry's case. I think all that says is that if you spend $65 or $70 million on a governor's race, it'll tighten up just because, you know, the ads close up. The third-party candidates didn't do as well as you might have expected. So if you're looking for where did the Tea Parties land, I think the Tea Parties landed where you suspected they were going to land the whole time. I think that's turns out, at least in Texas, to be kind of the innervated part, kind of the energetic part of the Republican Party right now. And that when you actually put it to a vote, most of the people that are that you see at Tea Party rallies and that you hear from in Tea Party, you know, in the Tea Party context, I think most of those turn out to be Republicans. You know, we kept covering this governor's race, waiting for White to turn it into an upset, for him to turn it into something other than what we expected, and it really sort of never came about.
I'm man enough to admit that I thought that it was going to be slightly closer, just slightly. I thought that I traveled with White, and I mean, he really worked it. He went to Tyler, Texas 5 times. He went to Midland. I covered him in Midland. I thought he had a fairly energetic rally there. I think I underestimated the size of the wave, the tsunami. I mean, I know you probably didn't want to use some of that lingo,
yes,
but
we were going to pass out liquor for this.
You know, so I think also that you know, the best criticism I think that I came across of White is what Harvey just articulated, which is that he kind of threw the kitchen sink at Perry. It was one day it was the dropout rate, the next day it was cronyism, and Chuck McDonald, a former spokesman for Ann Richards, said, "You tell me what Bill White's message is, because nobody knows what it is. If you say Perry, people say jobs. You say Bill White, people say the mayor of Houston," and that's, you know, where he started. I think that Perry took a lot of hits in the unusually. So I think one of the things that was remarkable about this campaign was that in the last month there was a hell of a lot of news that came out. I mean, the morning news, the Dallas Morning News, really did some brand new investigative journalism in the closing days of the campaign, and then that teacher retirement system memo came out, and it just didn't matter. It wasn't even a factor. I don't think. That's why, in defense of White, you know, was there any message that would have worked? You have to say too, though, that Bill White is the first candidate since 1994 to get more than 40% of the vote. I mean, Gary Marr. I covered the Gary Marr race in 1998, and I remember arguing with the campaign. You know, it's like the Texas poll. Remember the Scripps Howard Texas poll? And they were like, "This is a piece of trash. This is the worst poll we've ever seen." It was right. And what it said was he was going to get about 30% of the vote. And they said, "Come on, we're going to get our base." And you know what? That is the base. They did. And the base is 30%.
Shellacked, I think, is the word in vogue right now. Before we move on from this race, I want to ask you just real quickly, we'll start down at the other end so you don't always get the last straw, Jay. You know, comment a little bit on the Perry media strategy, particularly their approach towards newspapers this time. Mike Basilise at the Tribune event yesterday said pretty straightforwardly what I think everybody in the media was feeling. You know, they had come to the conclusion that newspaper endorsements actually had a negative effect on the vote choice of their base, at least. And it seemed to me that was a palpable part of the strategy, not just in not meeting with the newspapers, but in the way that the governor dealt with the media, you know, including his interview with Evan, I think, on the Tribune, in which, you know, they acted like Perry, you know, I guess the White campaign made that little video that acted like Perry that threatened to beat Evan up or something. And I don't think they went quite that far. But at the same time, I mean, it was clear that the Perry campaign was more than willing to fold the media into their opponents. Did you guys feel that way?
To what?
Kind of fold the media into the
Well,
White campaign and their opponents.
I mean, I think when it comes to the editorial boards, there's a point to be made there. I remember being with Perry during the primary in Amarillo. It was a West Texas swing right before he won handily. And by the way, a 40-point swing. I mean, you know, in April 2008, Perry was down 20 in public polls, and he basically won by 20. So that's a pretty significant swing. But anyway, I remember with respect to newspaper editorials, he was talking about the stimulus bills and the editorial boards. You know, the editorial boards don't like this, I realized then that he was basically using the editorial boards as this sort of nameless, faceless institution that has lost faith with the public in a way. At least that's the way it came across and the way it was being described. And it was very effective. And I thought it was definitely not a big risk in a Republican primary to just say, you know, I'm not going to do editorial boards. As far as I know, he's the only candidate in the United States that did it in the general election. I mean, there's no way to know that unless we do a careful study. I know Rick Scott in Florida talked about it, and I don't know if they ever did any editorial boards or not. They may not have. But this was definitely a good year to do that kind of strategy and to take that kind of risk. I thought it seemed kind of risky to me in a way to do this in a general election. I mean, Perry got just slaughtered in the newspaper editorials, and boy, did that really matter, didn't it?
Well, that's the point, right?
But one final thought, though, in terms of dealing with reporters, I personally did not see any change really from Perry in past year. I mean, obviously he didn't do the debate, but from past years, just in dealing with him in availabilities, news availabilities, or press conferences, and it's the way he dealt with us, you know, than any other election time.
I think it was a hit 'em high, hit 'em low thing. I mean, he sort of went after the institutions, like you say, and avoided the editorial boards and railed about the media and all of that, but was very accessible to daily reporters. I mean, we didn't have a hard time. I don't think anybody on this panel had a hard time getting hold of Perry whenever they needed him. And you know, there's an analog here. I think it's a little bit like they did stimulus money. You know, I don't want that money. I don't like those strings. We're not taking this unemployment insurance. I don't like this race to the top money. We'll take the 17 million. Meet me at the back door. It's kind of a high-low thing, and I think he used it really effectively. He got 2 endorsements in the general with newspapers he didn't even go to. Waco and Midland endorsed, but like Jay said, I mean, he basically ignored the editorial boards. He had this funny moment in Dallas where he had agreed to speak at I'll mess up the name of it, but it's a national conference of editorial writers from all over the country. And he went up and talked to him, and apparently it's customary at the end of these things to answer some questions, and he hightailed it. Finished his speech, said thank you, got off the rostrum, shook hands with a couple of people, and went out in the hall where they could all see him and did a couple of local TV interviews. Because those guys are talking to voters, and you guys aren't talking to voters. And I think the kickback, the Perry campaign made pretty sure we all saw the kickback from all those editorial writers. See, this is me versus the media.
Right.
It's not that the morning news stories about the TEF and about the land deals, it's not that they didn't matter. I mean, I think that we should continue to investigate public officials. I just think balanced against what the other things that voters care about, like jobs, economic security, those things mattered less, right? So I certainly don't want to think that we don't have a role at all. Like we should, obviously, right? But I think that we should continue to try and be a check on government, but that this is one of those years where that so-called wave was so big that all Perry really had to do was see it, seize upon it, ride it.
Which they're good at. Gromer, obviously ground zero of this
That's
in a
right,
way, in a couple of different ways. Given that, the scuttlebutt was that he was mad at you guys.
Well, he's always mad at us. So
Your paper in particular, I mean.
Yeah.
I loved that press conference where he was making fun of you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he
There was
likes
a
to
press
do that.
conference somewhere where Gromer pressed Perry on, well, what does White releasing his tax returns have anything to do with debating? And he said
Right.
something like, well, since you're such a bastion of journalistic excellence,
That's
Gromer,
right. Yeah. What the shocking thing to me was not the editorial boards, Perry skipping the editorial boards, but the debate, not debating. I think he really got away with something there. And again, this was the cycle to do it. But just think about it, a governor in this country in a major campaign, major race, with a legitimate opponent not debating and getting away with it, that's significant. But I agree with Jay. It's not like his name didn't appear in the newspapers every day. His picture didn't appear in the newspaper. It did. And there were numerous stories about him, many negative, but most positive with his message. So in the final analysis, he really didn't need editorial boards. And quite frankly, most candidates who've been on the landscape for 20, 25 years don't need editorial boards in a cycle like this.
Before we ever knew there was going to be a campaign between Bill White and Rick Perry, we knew that the midterm election was going to be it was going to be whiter, it was going to be older, and it was generally going to be more affluent than a presidential election. So you start from that base. That is Perry's base, and it's going to be very difficult for White to break through into that base. And then any measure of voter intensity, even in Texas, once you start tracking likely voters, it becomes obvious, I think, in retrospect, it obviously becomes obvious, but it becomes obvious that he was controlling the narrative and that everything else was just peripheral information. And I think everybody was surprised. I think this was a record gubernatorial election. I think it was just under 500,000 voters, which was about
4.9, right?
Which was about 400,000 to 500,000 more than the last one. And there was no evidence in any polling of any intensity for White. If they saw any of that intensity, then it was clear that they just needed us to make sure that his name was spelled right and the pictures were good.
So, but do you agree with the way the general characterization of how they handled the media?
Oh, first of all, my hat's off to Mark Miner and Rob Johnson, two very professional folks in terms of that I dealt with fairly frequently, and they were completely accessible. We never had any problem with the campaign on that side. They were thin-skinned at the beginning. You could tell the measure of what their polling was looking like because their skins became thicker and thicker as the. They didn't argue about verbs by the end of the campaign.
Yeah, it's a
Why
funny
don't you say it like
proposition.
that? Yeah.
Okay, so the governor's race. You could stop yawning now, Harv. I mean, so what about the legislative races? Let's talk about the House in particular in Texas. Evan asked this panel earlier. It's the question that everyone's asking everyone, which is, I'm not even going to say, did you see it coming? Because I didn't talk to all of you, but I talked to most of you, and I know you didn't. So I won't insult you by asking you what your initial number was. But let's put it this way: why didn't we see it coming? And I know Ross is thinking, well, I should be asking you that.
Let me just add one
Who's
real
my
quick
pollster?
thing. We on election day we put out a list of 33 House races that we said half of these are not competitive. Nobody don't worry about this. But these are all races on somebody's list. Well, that turned out to be, purely by humor, the most prophetic thing of the afternoon.
Every race on
Yes.
everybody's list.
Yes.
The
Every race
Democrat
on
lost.
anybody's list, actually. proved
Yeah, and a couple that
competitive.
weren't on
Yeah.
any list. What do you think, Romer?
Well, I think in Dallas County, where I'm from, Republicans won all 8 battleground races, and about 4 of them weren't supposed to be battleground races. It was shocking that Kirk England lost, for instance. Very surprising. And we didn't think Alan Vaught would be in trouble until the last couple of weeks of the campaign. I mean, you look up and Sheets has all this money, and all of a sudden Vaught is concerned and in trouble. But it's a situation, though, where I think we should have known.
That was my next question.
I mean,
yeah.
You know, it was predicted to be a wave election. We knew on a national level that there would be all these gains, Republican gains in the U.S. House. Why not in a state where the structural advantage is still Republican, and these districts, particularly in my area, that are still Republican districts or districts drawn to favor Republicans, we should have known that Stephanie Carter would beat Carol Kent and Cindy Burkett would beat Miklos. Those are districts that even though Democrats won in 2008 and 2006, it was because of Barack Obama or some other phenomena. So it just went back to where it was supposed to be. Now, the other races, you know, Dunham losing, I mean, that's
Jay, was there a
freaky
place
thing.
you could have looked that you know, people should have been looking to figure this out?
I really don't agree with that. I you know, think that a lot of the polls missed this. I think that there was a
Right. There were many internal polls that we did not publish, right? Or
yeah,
sometimes
but
we
I
just-
still think though that, you know, the Republican insiders in their wildest fantasy were talking about like 11 seats or something. I mean, this was much bigger than no credible analyst, nobody that I talked to ever really whispered that number or anything. I mean, I certainly thought that, you know, there were going to be some unpredictable results. And I think that, you know, when after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he said we lost the South for a generation. Well, we know that he was wrong because they lost it for much more than a generation. And if you look at, I mean, basically the white Democrats, Anglo Democrats, dropped 2/3 in the Texas House. The Democratic Party is largely a party of blacks and Hispanics, and you know, white Democrats are endangered. And I think that there was really, I also think that there, you know, Hispanics voted more Republican than a lot of people were anticipating, particularly in some of in those Corpus areas. And I really don't blame us for not coming up with a number like 22. I remember sitting in front of my computer and with my colleague, April Castro, and she said, "Oh my God." And I was like, "What?" She goes, I'm counting more than 20 right here. So I was like, okay, throw out the story we had before, which was already saying, yeah, you know, Democrats are going to lose. And we just like, bloodbath,
But
bloodbath.
I don't understand why you don't think we should have known, given the dynamic.
Because none of the people we were talking to reporting knew. I mean, when you're talking to all of these people and you say, okay, so let's go down the races. Let's go through all of these races. Let's talk about who's really in trouble. Who do you think is probably going to be okay? You know, the outliers, we're like Jay was saying, we're saying, you know, 11 and maybe 12. You know, I know you think I'm crazy, Ross, but I think 12 people might win. And then those first early numbers came in, and it was not just the people that you knew were, you know, that one's baked. You know, this can't, you know, Christy Thibault's district, she's been in trouble since she got elected. But you get down into the districts where everybody's saying, you know, maybe in a 100-year flood, maybe in a 1,000-year flood. And they got all of them. I mean, we have this, you know, we do this hot list that's, you know, red and orange and yellow, and it should have just all been red.
They ran the table.
You know, they're just, you know, these people are in the oven.
They completely ran the table. I mean, it was just, you know, not a single Republican incumbent lost. And people like Leibowitz and San Antonio,
Solomon Ortiz.
Solomon Ortiz, Ellen Cohen. I mean, those weren't, people weren't talking to me about those. And then some of the other ones that, you know, Chris Turner, who was very aggressive campaigners, like, you know, it's a terrible year for him. And,
But
you know,
that district, again, you know, that's one of those districts that only recently Democratic, and in this cycle, in this environment, it's understandable that he would lose.
I understand that. It's understandable. It's obviously understandable now.
Now it is. I mean,
but what I'm saying is that every single one of those, you go back and you look and it's like, you know, this guy, I mean, but so you have like 5 of them where you go, he's endangered. So you think of one of them's going to pull it out, but none of them did.
At least you follow this closely. What do you, I mean, do you feel like you should have caught it or not?
Well, Mr. Hugh Stiles said straight ticket voting was 60-40. So yes, I mean, if we really expect, well, first of all, yes, I guess that my answer is I agree with Jay and Gromer.
Okay, you got to choose one.
I'm torn. Straight ticket vote. If straight ticket voting was indeed 60-40, then of course the majority of Texas Republicans in the House would have become a supermajority just by simply riding that wave. Now, I do think it is a fair point that a lot of these districts shouldn't have been represented by Democrats.
Exactly.
I mean, should Chad Edwards have been representing that Central Texas district? Should Patrick Rose have been representing Hays, Caldwell, and Blanco counties when those folks have far more conservative sentiments? I mean,
No, but based on experience, I mean, based on the last 3 cycles, you kind of go, you know, Chad Edwards seems to be working in that district.
right. And
Here,
he
let me
said,
defend
But this is a different cycle. Though.
Well, you know, things are the same until they're different, right?
Well, let me defend our ignorance. Even today, if you do national polling, Democrats have 32% approval, Republicans have about 25% approval. I've never seen a shift like this with a party so unpopular. Now, that leaves 50% that are independent. In 2000, or at least self-described independent, whether they actually are or not. 2006, we've now had 3 elections in a row where independent voters have essentially fired who they thought was in charge. And this time it was a different order of magnitude, but the dynamic was the same. In 2006, in the midterm, they fired Republicans. In 2008, they fired Republicans. In 2010, they did a hell of a job firing
Although it'll be
Democrats.
interesting to see what the exit polls look like on that, Harvey, because I mean, part of this is going to be a turnout gap that's going to have a partisan pattern. I mean, I sometimes think that the independents are a little bit overrated in some of this. I want to ask you guys just a quick follow-up on this, not to go completely, but part of the thing that's interesting is I hear you guys argue we should have seen it, we shouldn't have seen it. Well, it's been the way it's been, and so, is part of this about your relationship to your sources? I mean, and where you get your information? Because in some ways it seems to me like Gromer's argument a little bit, not to single you out, but it seems like you're kind of saying, look, if you stood back and looked at the numbers on these things and had a kind of numerical sense of this wasn't so completely unprecedented. Or on the other hand, it seems to me there's a sense in which I've heard from a lot of my reporter acquaintances, well, so-and-so called me today, they're saying X, but I know they're lying to me. It's the last week of the election, nobody tells you the truth.
This is a great panel, right? But if you talk to some of the local reporters in these individual races, I bet you they will tell you.
I knew that guy was going to lose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Bud from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram knew several months ago that Turner and Pearson would lose. He knew it. So I think maybe on the statewide level we had blinders on, but I think on a local level, the people who covered those races, they would have been able to tell you that those Democrats were in trouble.
But see, by that reasoning, Joe Heflin never should have won. He won when Obama won in 2008 in a district that...
his district went 92% for McCain.
Right.
I know. I mean, and you get that many people to switch and still vote for a Democrat. Bowie County, what used to be one of the most Democratic counties in Texas, lock Republican after Tuesday. I mean, they wiped every Democrat out. Sure, in hindsight, it's easy to go in and say, how could Bowie County ever have any Democrats? Well, they did until Tuesday. They don't anymore.
Well, Anderson County is the same thing. You're in Deep East Texas. Anderson County knocks off 2 long-term Democratic county commissioners. It's like they've always split the ticket. It's always been red at the top, blue at the bottom.
We'll move on to more about the House, but I mean, another interesting kind of way of framing some of this political change. I mean, Jay, you cited, LBJ's thing. I mean, one thing about that, though, is that Texas was always a little different than the rest of the South. I mean, from a kind of academic perspective, when you look at Texas, it's sort of the long-delayed realignment, right? So in a sense, the question isn't, how is it that these changed now? It's how did it take it so long? Why have there been Democrats in Bowie County? How could Heflin have won that race ever in terms of the existing underlying kind of partisan patterns that Gromer was kind of suggesting we look at? So what do you get out of the House with 99 Republicans that you wouldn't have gotten with 86?
Well, everything that the Senate passed, that the House stopped. Voter IDs that, easy one.
Ultrasounds, before getting an abortion.
I think they probably ought to just shutter the Ways and Means Committee. I don't think we're going to see a tax bill for a while. It's going to be, crickets over there for a bit. I think it's hard to get a gaming bill out. Particularly hard now. I think it was hard before. I think it's particularly hard now, both because you have people who are conservatives and oppose gambling, and because you have people who say, it's not just that we're against taxes, it's that we're against fueling government. And even if it's not taxes, we don't want to supply it with any more revenue. So no.
Were you here this morning?
No, I wasn't actually.
How many people were here this morning? That's a pretty accurate representation of what we heard this morning, I think, to some extent.
So, I think there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen over there that wouldn't have happened last time. In an interesting way, the Senate's kind of in the position, not that the Senate's ever stopped anything, but, the Senate's kind of in the position of stopper. Yeah. It's easier to get things, they can amend the Constitution every week by Thursday in the House.
What do you think, Harvey?
The best line of the evening was, in my opinion, was that next session voter ID is going to be on local and consent.
I see a lot of people writing that down. People are going to dine out on that for a week or so.
Every freshman that comes to the Texas, unless they were a staffer before they come to the Texas House, thinks they start out representing an ideology and they represent a political party. It's not until their second or third term that they begin to realize they represent school districts and hospital districts and major employers and small employers and whatever the mix of that district is. So in a sense, this is a much more malleable House, not just because of the partisan affiliation, but because of the fact that they're going to have to take their clues from whoever it is that they pick as their mentors, and I think that we'll have a sense of that probably 2 or 3 weeks into the session, who is picking who to follow, but most of these freshmen, and I don't mean to demean them by any stretch of the imagination, but like in 2003, when the new freshman class came in, most of their political education had more to do with talk radio and Fox News than it did with any actual interface with the process. So I think obviously it's going to be dramatically more conservative than it was. The question is, how open are they to actually figuring out who they represent?
What do you think, Jay?
I think the Democrats are going to be a non-factor. They probably can't even manage a quorum break at this point. I mean, assuming they do have 51, they could, if everybody was there and somebody didn't get sick or something. But I think obviously it's going to be much, much more conservative. I think redistricting just got a lot more fascinating because there is no way they can draw 99
how do you do
Republican
that?
seats.
You gotta
exactly. I mean, you think. I mean, that's going to. They're going to have to throw some Republicans overboard in the redistricting. So that's going to be really fascinating as well. And I think that a lot of the things that the Republican leadership would rather have just kept bottled up because it would, like the immigration bills that are probably good to get the base motivated, but not necessarily good on statewide PR basis. All those things. I mean, this just the dam breaks on that, and that stuff just gets flown.
So does this make the House more fun or less fun to cover?
Yes.
More fun to cover, of course. Jim Pitt said to me Tuesday night that passing a budget will be a lot easier now. Because really they don't have to compromise. And then Dan Branch said to me yesterday that Health and Human Services and Education make up the largest portion of the Texas budget in terms of expenditures. And he said between Health and Human Services and Education, he would prioritize education in terms of the traditional role of government. So look out, Health and Human Services. And that's interesting because, that hits home. Harvey and I were talking about on the radio this morning about Medicaid funding.
If I may, after the 2003 mid-decade redistricting, we essentially fired all the Democrats in Congress just as the Democrats were taking power. So we had the most powerless congressional delegation we'd probably had in 50 or 70 years. If you're a rural representative right now, who's left that has any institutional memory in a budget-cutting session that's going to protect rural interests? You've got Tom Craddock, you've got Warren Chisholm, you've got Leo Berman. Then the field gets fairly thin among rural legislators with any kind of experience. Again, with redistricting, there's 3 new reps that are anchored in Lubbock. Only one's going to be here in 2013. So that's what makes it such a fascinating budget session is the rurals who should be defending nursing homes and hospitals and emergency rooms back in their districts don't, first of all, they think they're part of a jihad to overthrow government. But second, you know, they're going to look up after the session as all these things are closing, all the schools that they're getting hurt and whatever, and they're not even going to realize what has happened, I think, until it's too late.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of pressure on them not to spend because of their philosophy, but a lot of that spending is necessary in those districts. And I wouldn't want to be an urban lawmaker right now because it will be tough. And I think also Speaker Joe Straus is in an interesting position because if it gets crazy and all these, you know, immigration bills or bills involving social issues arise, what will he do? I mean, how will he control a House?
He's always said
What's
he
his
wants to
approach?
let the will of the House, you know, be.
Well, Strauss's leadership model, assuming, which is, you know, not entirely in evidence, and we'll talk about that, but assuming that Strauss is Speaker again, this is going to mean a change in leadership style, right? I mean, in part for reasons you're talking about, right, Gromer?
I would, yeah, of course.
You don't have to balance the number of Democrats and Republicans running committees now. I mean, you know, just to start with, you can put all the Democrats on Ways and Means, you know, have fun over there. I mean, he doesn't have to compromise in ways that he had to compromise last time. I mean, last time, regardless of how he got elected, he had 76 of these and 74 of those, and you got to balance it. And now you don't have to balance it. You got a lot more room to be a Republican.
But what is he? Is he a conservative Republican
I think he
in a
is
mode
now.
of these guys? Oh, he is now. Okay.
Well, I was going to ask you that. I mean, I was going to bat that down to you, Jay. I mean, what do you think? This is going to be the moment we're going to find out. I mean, Strauss in some ways has been a little bit of a cipher for people. What do you expect we're going to see?
I asked one Republican about that, and he said that it's 50-50 whether Strauss survives or not. I think that, and you know, what do I know? I'm just a reporter. But to answer the question about whether this will be fun, I really do think this is going to be fun. At some point, there's going to be a moment of reckoning when a lot of these people that have come in and talked about spending cuts and lower taxes and all that, and then you have to deal with a $25 billion shortfall. That's going to be interesting to watch. But I think Strauss is obviously perceived as a moderate, and so there's a little tension there, obviously, over whether or not he's conservative enough for what has now become a very, very conservative chamber. I think speakers' races are unlike anything else out there. It's not any kind of whimsical sort of trait, or you know, the voters a lot of times do seemingly whimsical things, and a speaker's race is extremely personal. And there's so much, you know, intrigue, and it's sort of like a royal court. I really covering the Craddock speaker's race with the Craddock-Strauss thing, to me, was one of the most fascinating things I've ever watched in any political body anywhere. When you throw somebody overboard like that people knew and all of that. So, you know, that's one of those things I think is very volatile, very hard to predict, and based on things that, you know, it's not like, what's your position on this or that? It's very, very personal.
You know, what's interesting is that the speaker held some Republicans who were thought to be in trouble, like Linda Harper Brown, not exactly a Strauss person, right? But he came to her aid big time with some cash when she was in that race with Loretta Haldenwang. She wins. You know, how much gratitude now does she have for the speaker, or is it okay, thanks, but you know, let's get back to
This is about
fighting.
tomorrow.
Right, exactly. But we'll see.
I think that the dichotomy between Chisholm and Strauss is pretty interesting. Chisholm represents the 20 hardcore Republican conservatives or 15 hardcore Republican conservatives who want predictable outcomes. They want the speaker to push an agenda. much as Craddick did. Strauss is more about fair process. Of course, last session he was hired not to cast a shadow. This time he's obviously got to cast a shadow. But I think there's 100 members there that, well, not that many anymore. 80 members, 90 members there that for the first time in 6 or 7 years last session actually got to push an agenda, build a coalition, pass a bill, not suffer in the penalty box. And they like that process. And I think that's why there was even though there is a grassroots effort ginned up by Heritage Alliance and a lot of these right-wing groups to put pressure on, especially the freshmen, to reject Strauss, anybody with any institutional memory much prefers the model of last session to the model of the session before.
In the end, do you think Chisholm will be the candidate?
I'm going to get a call in just after I turn my phone off, but no. Well, they're floating Larry Taylor's name today.
Right.
So you covered this really closely during the Strauss-Craddick switchover. Jay put it at 50-50. What do you think?
I don't think there's going to be a speaker's race. I just, talking to Strauss yesterday, post-election, he made a really compelling argument for why he should stay speaker, which is that he's presided over the largest gains that his party has seen on this side of the Civil War. I mean, and you're right, the Godfather model does work in politics. You do a favor, you know, he's done a lot of favors for a lot of members who are now loyal to him. And so, as much as I love a speaker's race, I think they are compelling and they're fun to cover, and stakeouts are fun.
We were on that stakeout together. But I'm just telling you what a Republican insider told me. Again, it's one of those things that it's voodoo, man. I mean, it's a speaker's race is like, it's not like a traditional political fight.
You know, I fall out from the speaker's race a little bit. What is, as you guys are calling around and talking to people and on your cell phones in the last 48 hours, what's the impact of this been on kind of the inside game as people are talking to you and trying to spin what's happened in the last 48 hours?
You're talking about the House results?
Yeah.
One conversation that will remain with me is I talked to one Democratic insider who told me that nobody's calling each other. No, I mean, they were in just complete disarray and just completely, it was a mushroom cloud. I mean, it was just a mushroom cloud. They don't even know what hit them. There are people who are out of work now. I mean, it's just like a lot of people. And they're just walking around in a daze. And so that would be the first thing I would say is just complete disarray among Democrats.
The bright side, though, for Democrats is that next session, well, two bright sides. One is I don't see how it could get possibly any worse. The other bright side is
we think we've cut off all of the parts that we need to cut off.
You've really got a future in morale building for the Democratic Party, I think, Luis.
Elliot Neistats back there, he came up and said, put it to me straight. So the other silver lining is that next session is going to be incredibly difficult. And with this supermajority, then all the credit and all the blame goes to Republicans. And so from a political standpoint, that could be advantageous to Democrats because next session, just purely governing, is going to be very hard. And one Democratic lawmaker who I talked to on Tuesday night after the bloodbath said, you know what, I'm actually kind of glad that some of my fellow Democrats lost because next legislature isn't one that I would want to be part of anyway.
Right. And some of them more than others, though, probably.
Right. It's got to be demoralizing, though, to say if you're the Texas Democratic Trust and you come so close in 2008, you're right there. You're poised to take the House. Your dream was to get it by 2010.
It was a tie. You remember this?
Yeah. And then all of a sudden it just all comes apart. And now you're looking at a situation where you may be back where you were in 2003 and redistricting is coming up. So you're looking at another 10 years potentially out of power. That has to be just...
And is that what people are calling and telling you?
I mean, they're trying to figure out how, you know, these urban legislators are trying to figure out what to do. How are we going to fight this overwhelming force, you know? Because they're stronger in number now than they were in 2003.
So I think that's right. I think for the Democrats, this is exactly the wrong time for Mount Etna to go off and for Pompeii to land like this. Is that the maps get drawn now for the next 10 years. And you've got the worst or the most one-sided House since the last time the House was this one-sided was 1985 when there were 95 Democrats in it. And that wasn't a redistricting year. I mean, you get this opportunity for the Republicans to draw a map. It'll be difficult to hold on to 99 seats, but I don't think it'll be particularly difficult to hold on to the high 80s, low 90s. And they draw the Senate map, and they draw the congressional map, and they draw the state board map. You know, they have a chance to institutionalize what happened on Tuesday in a way that they weren't thinking about on Monday.
You gotta wait till baby Huey grows up, and baby Huey is the Hispanic electorate, that the Hispanic vote out there. And I think that's the savior for the Democratic Party in Texas.
Well, you know, let's go ahead, Harvey.
Tell me what the turnout model is that you do redistricting on. Do you base it on a presidential year? Do you base it on a midterm year? This was an anomalous year. 2008 was an anomalous year. The next election is, if they go for 95 seats, if they try and sustain 99 seats, the odds are that we'll be back at a tie in 2 election cycles. Strauss has intimated in the House that before the tsunami, that 82, 83, 60% plus districts are sustainable through the decade, and if he goes off and does something else, his legacy would be that that he left the House in Republican control through the decade. If they go for 95, then you have the same phenomena that we just had in the 2001 redistricting, which is all these transitions of racial and ethnic minorities that are leaning Democratic, younger voters, all these other things. They vote in presidential years, and you draw too many lean Republican districts. If you try again for 3 Republican districts in Travis County, I can almost guarantee you that you'll turn the county back Democratic in 4 or 5 years. So.
You know, I wonder if you guys don't think along these lines that this year wasn't a little bit of the end of an illusion for the Democrats. I mean, Grummer's saying, well, we're waiting for baby Huey to grow up. I mean, with the Hispanic vote. I mean, I think the analogy I usually use is waiting for Godot.
You know, Ken Herman, a fellow journalist at the Austin American-Statesman, told me a long time ago, just when you think Democrats in Texas have hit rock bottom, they find a new floor. And if this is not rock bottom, I don't know what it looks like. I think a case can be made, and I'm not making it, I'm just saying I think a case can be made that this was the high watermark for Republicans. I don't know how they can really, I mean, they control both houses of the legislature with huge margins. They have every statewide office. There is not a state in the nation like it. It's like Utah with 10 times the population.
Yeah.
I mean, think about this. Every state that touches Texas, now I know that these other states regionally the Republicans had a good night. So let's just back up to Monday. You still have statewide parties in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico. There is not a state that touches Texas, and there is not a state that looks like Texas demographically that has anything near the Republican dominance. Now, you explain that to me. Part of it is that once you win in Texas, it's easy. You're on top of a hill, and there's so many media markets here. Matt Dowd told me not long ago that Bush's former pollster, that Texas looks most like the nation in terms of states. So, and he was making the case that Perry might run for president, and that running in Texas is like running the nation because you've got rural, urban, all of that. But there is not any other state that I know of that went from Democratic lock to Republican lock, and never the twain shall meet in as short a period of time. And I think that obviously Republicans are going to help institutionalize, as you put it, institutionalize some of their gains through redistricting. It's inevitable.
Well, I mean, there's something a little bit misleading about the nature of the Democratic lock here for quite a while in terms of ideology and policy.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other piece of that is
right.
that I think we might look back and see 2006, 2008. We just looked at that and thought it was a reversal in the trend, and that was the glitch.
Let me give attribution. The best line of 2003 was said by Elliot Neistat. He walked into the House chamber, looked around, and said, well, the House has always been conservative. We just have a few more Republicans.
I want to open it up for questions soon, but we can't really leave this without talking about, the the most visible elephant in the room, I guess, in a lot of ways now, and that is that the Perry national ambition. And again, like the number, I won't embarrass your intelligence by saying, is he going to run? But talk about the impact of his obvious ambition, his obvious national ambition.
Didn't we do this in 1998?
Yeah, but we had money in 1998.
Oh, that's right.
What do we think?
Jay spent a lot more time with him on the road.
You know, I think that Perry, certainly in what he says and the people around him, what they say, he's not running, he's not running, he's not running. He's said it pretty categorically. I think it's fair to say he's certainly not running right now.
He's running.
I mean, right now, he is not going to Iowa and doing some of the things that you would think. But he has written this book now, Fed Up. He did the Today Show this morning. He's certainly embracing his role as a national figure, and he has been very upfront about that. I think that, you know, what you hear people whisper is that, well, you know, let's see what it looks like after the book comes out and see how well the sales go and see how the session goes, and then, you know, you reassess. But he clearly has become a national figure, and I don't know, I guess the opposite of tone deaf would be perfect pitch, and I think in some ways Perry has had perfect pitch for the mood of the electorate.
He fits the moment.
He really seized on it when with that Creighton, what's his name, Creighton, the press conference, the Tea Party press conference. Brandon Creighton, excuse me, and in April 2009, and he became a leader of the Tea Party before it was on everybody's lips. You know, he's got one of the best political radar systems that has ever been created. He really does. And I admit I thought that Perry would kind of go a little bit to the center in the general. I never thought he was going to go, you know, I'm a centrist, but I just thought that he would maybe move away a little bit. He didn't change it at all. His primary strategy and his general election strategy were exactly the same. And I think that this whole sort of firebrand conservatism, Tea Party thing, Perry is sort of the elder statesman of it, even though he's will be the longest serving governor now in the country. I think
in the universe.
Yeah, as Larry Sabato says, governor for life, Rick Perry. He really has been very careful not to rule out running for a fourth term. Okay, very, very careful not to rule that out. And anyway, I think it is actually possible, even though it's crazy to imagine that he's really not running for president.
I suspect you're going to be in the minority on this, so we'll let Gromer jump on first, and then everyone else on top of Gromer on top of you.
All right. Well, he's definitely running. I mean, he's running for president. I mean, and why shouldn't he? He can take a nice little peek. He can go to Iowa, go to those early caucus states or primary states, take a look, and if it's not there, he can come back and run for governor again in 2014. I think that's his plan, to take a look, because the beauty of running for president is you can run and you don't have to really run. You know what I mean? And I think that's what he'll do. He'll go right up to the water, and if he thinks the water will taste good, he'll drink, and that'll be that. And quite frankly, it'll be great for us if he runs.
Back to what's important.
Think of the stories.
Elise?
I was told that he is likely to be named to head the RGA later this year, or later, I guess, early next year, which is right, which he has done before, which would also help his national stature. But even if he doesn't run, I think Sarah Palin has shown us that you don't actually have to have an office to be a major conservative brand in America and make a lot of money. So it would be very profitable for Perry to remain governor, or finish out his term as governor and become a Sarah Palin type figure.
It's a free market solution.
Right.
So you think it's about the money? Yeah, that's possible.
One of the raps on why Perry could never be president, supposedly, was that Texans aren't welcome in D.C. anymore. You'd have to have a passport to come from Texas to D.C. post-Bush. What I think Fed Up is was originally intended to be a marker against Bill White, but now I think it is the end of compassionate conservatism, at least Texas version of compassionate conservatism. This is fiery conservatism. And it is a challenge, a throwing down the gauntlet kind of conservatism. This way he never has to actually defend Bush, run against Bush in a Republican primary. He's put the mantle down, and it is very different from George Bush, and it separates him from George Bush. I think he wants to be drafted more than anything else, but you know, he's putting himself in the path without ever having to say he wants it. And when you start checking off, you can't have a Mormon, you can't have a pro-choice, you can't have, the list gets off of big state possibilities with money. The list gets pretty small pretty quick.
I think one could argue that, you know, the plan is really predicated on getting drafted.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I think you said, I tend a little bit to be with Jay on this. I sort of take Perry at his word right now that he's really not running. And he really, you know, the way he articulates it, he says this book and this whole argument about federalism is really about, I want to lead, this is Perry talking, I want to lead a national movement of the states taking back power from the federal government. And we'll see where that goes. I'm not interested in being president of the United States. I'm not interested in running for that. I don't want to go to Washington. And I sort of take him at his word for that. But I also think that, you know, you put yourself in the way of opportunities. And one of the things Perry's been really good at is being in the right place at the right time. One of the interesting things about Tax Day 2009 was that after Perry made those comments about secession, Hutchison was telling her aides, we just won the election. That's the day she lost the election.
Oops.
I mean, it's just a different kind of a read. I think he has terrific radar about this stuff. He has the advantage this year of going, or at this moment anyway, of being kind of a bright face in a weak field. I mean, you know, you sort of go Pawlenty, Mitch Daniel, Sarah Palin, Haley Barbour. None of these things really works, and other than the allergy to people with Lucchese's on in Washington. I think he's in some ways a perfect Republican candidate. He's acceptable to the fiscal conservatives. He's acceptable to the social conservatives. He's attractive. He speaks well. He checks all of these boxes. You set yourself out there. You see how the opportunities ride, and I think it could go his way.
I mean, I think purely just kind of looking at this in a spatial way, Sarah Palin actually creates the space for him.
Right, because he becomes somebody who's sort of in that space politically,
But not.
But he's not Sarah Palin.
Right.
There's everybody has to have somebody to be better than, and you know. So you sort
I'm
of,
not sure how to put it exactly
sort of
that
create
way,
this
but
opening.
that's why you're Ross Ramsey and I'm not. I'm going to open this for questions.
A lot of the Democratic incumbents that were defending were plenty well funded. I mean, I think by election day, Steve Mostyn himself had put in, and the Mostyn law firm had put in $9 million to White and then down ballot races combined. So, I mean, when we looked at those 8-day reports and the 30-day out reports, they were fairly matched. So I think that lends itself to the answer, which is that the wave was stronger than money.
The guy, I'm looking up this number, the guy that beat Solomon Ortiz had no money at all. So there's some element of that. I got to say here, I meant to say earlier, the luckiest guy in Texas is Alan Ritter, who was running in East Texas and didn't have a Republican on the ticket. It was like, you know.
He is one of the 6 white Democrats left.
Right. If you array the Texas House from the districts in the Texas House based on statewide elections from most conservative to most liberal, the outlier used to be David Farabee for a minute, and then it was Chuck Hobson for a minute, and it was Heflin for a minute, and now it's all the way down to Alan Ritter. And the only reason I think that he's sitting there, not any comment about Alan Ritter, but I think the reason he's sitting there is because there was nobody to ride the wave running against him.
I think he could have won it. Somebody could have won it with the filing fee.
Right.
I'm almost surprised he didn't lose anyway.
And so, some of these races, though, I think the money amplified the sentiment that was already there. You know, I think if you're in a normal year, you know, Chet Edwards and Jim Dunham's synergies have worked together pretty well. You know, they overlay a lot. You know, they get a lot of Chet Edwards gets a lot of his purely Democratic vote, or has up until this year, out of Jim Dunham's district. They both outspend their Republican opponents when they even have them. The Republicans barely found Marva Beck this year. to run against Dunham. That was a last-minute deal. And I just think that they had enough fuel to throw on the sentiment that was already out there. I think the money accelerated it.
Yeah, I agree. In Alan Vaught's district, his opponent, Sheets, had a lot of money, and he was able to capitalize on the wave, had some money to spend. I think that was important.
This goes back to one of the first questions, which is, in 1994, when the last time there was a big Republican tsunami, it didn't translate down ballot. There wasn't an automatic default to vote Republicans into the Texas House. I think you had to spend money to raise name identification, to make people realize that there was a race, and that absent the money, Marva Beck probably would have. There wasn't that antipathy towards Jim Dunham, but once you put $700,000 into that race, suddenly she comes from one of the rural counties. Nobody in McLennan County knew who she was. I asked, by the way, to folks over at TLR if they early on if they really thought they could beat Jim Dunham, and the response back was, well, nobody objected when we put his name on the table. I would reframe that and say that it's not, I think the Lieutenant Governor is under an enormous amount of pressure. If he wants to run for the Senate, he's got to win the Republican primary. And so everything that the Lieutenant Governor does is going to be fashioned off of the Republican primary, and the 2/3 rule is not particularly popular among Republican primary
And you remember what happened in 2003, right? When that's how they got the redistricting bill through, right?
They suspended the 2/3 rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It only takes
So
a simple
you're
majority to
absolutely
suspend
right.
the 2/3 rule, and so they certainly have that.
We had to throw that to Henson because he's a pollster.
I think the problem, we didn't do a lot
We had
of
to throw
polling.
that to Henson because he's a
local
pollster.
polling.
But there was a big discussion in a lot of these races, both by the Republican pollsters and Democratic pollsters, on what's a likely voter this year. Who votes? 2008 was an anomaly year. Everybody knows that. 2006 was an anomaly year. 31% of the people that voted in the governor's race in 2006 didn't vote for a Republican or a Democrat. They're all weird years in their way. And so you've got to figure out what the voter base is. And if you just take a quick look at a map and say, you can say pretty easily and pretty quickly, South Texas didn't vote like South Texas usually votes. So you got to establish a norm if you're polling. But, we ought to let Henson do that.
I mean, there's two things that I think that are going on here, and one of them kind of got to the question I was asking these guys, which is that there's no universally available public polling at the district level, right? And so everybody is forced to consume this information that actually comes at two different removes, right? There's 2 degrees of separation by the time any of us get it. There's the pollsters preparing the data for clients in a business relationship. That's all I'll say about that. And then there's what they choose to get, what they choose to release to these guys and to the public, which, as we all saw all along, was often very incomplete, partial in many different ways. So that's one thing. The other thing is at the aggregate level, I mean, I had a lot of conversations with people. We were getting much bigger Republican surges underneath the surface in our polling at the UT Tribune poll. And if you looked at most polls, people have been complaining about the statewide polling, but it was actually pretty consistent across the board for the most part. I mean, there's always some variations that come from the statistics of it. But you would see the governor's race pretty close, with a number of people that were undecided that didn't want to commit, that I think, if you didn't push them, that I think had to do with some of the ambiguity about Perry among some folks, some of the hangover from the primary. Underneath that, the generic matchups, huge Republican majorities all the way through. We were getting 10, 12, 15 points as long ago as a year ago. But without the district level returns, you're left without enough sampling in those districts to say, okay, so I know that we should probably add on something from this reserve pool of activated Republican voters. Should I add 2 to these numbers that people are giving me? Should I add 4? Should I add 6? But you're really just kind of going like this. Does that help kind of?
Plus, I would add, I didn't talk to a single pollster that predicted a 500,000 vote surge. All the models that people were using were based on a 4.3 to 4.6 million turnout. And you throw all those new voters in there, and it's got to mess up your screens. Weightings. I'm sorry, weightings.
What was turnout at the end of?
4.9.
Yeah, just under 5. What else we got back here?
I didn't see the amount of corporate money in Texas, with a couple of exceptions, that they saw in some other races around the country. There was some corporate and some union money in the Edwards race, in Edwards-Flores race, and to some extent in the Dunham-Beck race. One of the road groups, American Crossroads or the other, whatever the other crossroads was, showed up there a little bit. The biggest, now I should also say, not all of the reporting in Texas races occurs, financial reporting occurs until January. So, whatever happened in the last week isn't completely clear. We saw some corporate money show up in Texas very quickly after that decision. In fact, I think we were one of the first places that saw a corporate ad campaign, and it was against Chuck Hobson in his special election, and it fell short. I think we'll see more of that. I mean, these races are getting amazingly expensive. There were, I think I counted 7 House races that were above $1.5 million. Still pays $600 a month. But we haven't really seen it yet.
Other questions?
I'm not sure. The second
sorry, go ahead.
That second question was, how we cover Texas politics going to change? We're always kind of. I think the short answer is no. I mean, you ultimately have to end up going to sources that have been reasonably reliable in the past. You can only look at what's disclosed. In terms of financial reporting, there's always under the table kinds of things that happen. And I think we focus a lot on the State House, and that is a closed universe. Once the legislative session starts, we know who the cast of characters are. We know what the dynamics are. Sometimes we don't know all the dynamics in the district, but this is a closed shop that we're in here.
For me, the frustrating thing for newspapers is we have fewer resources, and there are so many competitive races out there now. And in North Texas, you had all those House races, and Chet Edwards was running down the road, and then you had still the governor's race, and an intriguing countywide race in Dallas County where the Democrats actually won. So what we have to figure out is how to divvy up those resources. And in cycles like this, it really shows that we have to get better, because some of those State House races went largely uncovered. Not totally, but largely uncovered. And that's unfortunate.
I think that, the idea that we really know what's going on in legislative races is sort of exaggerated, because really it's very, very hard to cover legislative or congressional races from a large, in a large area like a state, or when you're talking about the congressional races. I remember in '94, there hardly anybody saw the Republicans taking over. I mean, hardly any credible analyst. It might have been, was it Charlie Cook, I think, that actually predicted that? And I believe that's what sort of was one of the foundations for him becoming so successful and becoming such a brand name, was because he was one of the only ones who saw it coming. So it's really hard we don't have good polling. I mean, a lot of it is just, hey, I heard, so-and-so's tracking poll showed him down. I remember hearing that Stephen Frost was in trouble about 2 weeks ago, that his tracking poll all of a sudden went negative, and Homer a little bit later, but also negative. And so, and then of course, it didn't do it justice to what the end result was. I mean, these people just got slaughtered.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, the congressional districts, I think, you can probably pretty safely say, sort of based on Texas history, the congressional districts, either the legislature is going to make a deal or the three federal judges are going to draw those lines. That's kind of what happened last time. The three federal judges drew lines that were based on the existing map, which is where they always start. I mean, they always, their tendency is to say, what's the least amount of change we can make to this map to make it legal? The Republicans found that unsatisfactory last time and came back. Whether they'll have the power to do that again, I don't know. But you basically have a Republican legislature drawing maps, mostly Republican judges in that food chain looking at the maps. And the one stopper here is the Department of Justice. You can sideswipe them a little bit with a direct appeal to the D.C. court, which can also grant preclearance. So, I don't think it's the whole card a lot of Democrats think it is. I think, they get a shot at it, but I think this is a Republican table. They beg pardon? Supreme Court too. Right.
Question is how long the Voting Rights Act survives.
That's the other question. Is we had this case that started in this somebody's garage in North Austin, the North Austin Municipal Utility District number 1. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and basically, if you read that opinion, it opens the door to a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. It says, do we really need this part? Do we really need preclearance? How come you can do in Michigan what you can't do in Texas? I think that could be one of the things that opens up in this redistricting process.
Yeah, I mean, the backstop that the Democrats have been counting on may suddenly disappear.
Right.
The back talk I'm hearing from the Republican congressional delegation in D.C. is that the delay adventure was terrible for them, that they overreached, they cost themselves, cost them in legislative races subsequently, and that they're perfectly, if we get 4 seats, I didn't agree with you about this originally, but I have since had a number of congressional types tell me that 2-2, 2 Democratic, 2 Republican is the least amount of controversy. It keeps the relative balance of strength. But the bigger question is, there's not much of a constituency, it seems to me, for the Legislative Redistricting Board to draw the lines. Certainly among the legislators that went through it in 2001, I can't think of a single senator. Well, that's not true. Most of the Republican senators that you talk to don't want to let David Dewhurst, Greg Abbott, Jerry Patterson into their business, which is drawing their maps. And over on the House side, I'll say it again, if you reach for 90 or 95 by the end of the decade, or certainly by the middle of the decade, we'll have Democrats will have parity again. If you don't draw 65% Republican districts, they'll be competitive within 2 election cycles, especially with the speed of growth of the Hispanic voter, the incremental increase in the Hispanic vote, and at least for the time being, the Hispanic vote still being 65, 70% Democratic.
The younger demographic tends not to have landlines, and so there is this great debate in polling about how to account for cell phones and folks that are only on cell phones. I think social media at this point is still too unreliable and too small of a population of people who vote are on it, and so I don't foresee that being used as a tool in trying to test the waters yet.
Right, I mean, there's research going on the demographics of social media. The Pew folks are doing a bunch of work. But I think, Elise is right in the sense that if you're going to go and draw something that's either a literal random sample or analogous to a random sample, we don't know how to do that with social media, and I think it probably introduces more bias that outweighs any benefits you might get from the people you're catching.
I think I was going to say one thing that for all the talk about, there's all, and Henson obviously is much more into this world than I ever will be, but there's all this talk about polling. It's terrible. We can't catch the people because they've gone off landlines and all this. You know what? The poll, they were right. I mean, again,
that newspaper's poll was dead on. Yeah,
they were just dead on. I mean, it's just it's and of course every time when his poll comes out, the loser in the poll is like, this poll is crap. It's look at it. I mean, it's
the only poll that counts is on election day.
Right, and you hear all that stuff too. But I mean, I think for all of the talk about how there's a degraded polling infrastructure, and that we have no, they're not any good anymore. And, they were right. They were right.
The other thing that was interesting in the polling, and this is,
by the way.
I mean, there's some rearview mirror in this, as in all of this. But if you look at the polling and look at what people said they were concerned about, it's really how they voted. The national stuff in our polling was consistently all about the budget, all about finance, federal spending, the economy, jobs, unemployment. They were worried about their wallets. The state, what do you think is the most important issue facing the state? What do you think those are? It's immigration and border security. I mean, if you look at the results that we got through that prism and look at those polls, it's not the polls that were wrong. I mean, to the extent that we were wrong, maybe we were looking at the wrong things in the polls or interpreting them incorrectly. But all of the pieces to this were laying out there.
Yeah, going back to your question, I mean, the difficulty is taking all that stuff and mapping it onto district races in any kind of reasonably precise way, with what you have to work with at hand. And obviously there's money involved in that too. I mean, I'd love to go out and do a random sample in every House district in the state, but I don't have anybody to pay for it.
The Strama opponent didn't have a lot of money. I mean, isn't that right?
Yeah, he had some, but not, yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of a non-aggression pact against
Yeah,
Mark.
I want you to talk about that. I think I'd feel more comfortable with you talking about that. Go ahead.
Well, there's a supposition out there. I mean, Mark is related to Trabulsi. Trabulsi is one of the leaders of Texans for Lawsuit Reform. He's been careful on his voting history. And so the perception, whether true or not, is that he gets a pass.
Trabulsi ran against him pretty hard when he first came out, though.
First
right?
time.
First time, yeah.
Against an incumbent named Jack Stick. But yeah, the money in this race, if you take what Strama had on hand and what he spent from mid-year to the 8-day reports, he was at about $300,000. This doesn't count third-party money. He was at about $300,000, and McGinnis was at about $170,000. So he had him overmatched on money. I think a week of enough Austin TV that people who are busy with other things see it is about 100 to 120,000. Is that a ballpark, Donna? Something like that. 120,000 a week in Austin. So Strama's got enough money here for a couple of weeks of TV, and McGinnis doesn't. I think that tells part of the tale. That district's also shifted. I mean, it was drawn for Republicans, and it's been a little bit more strongly Democratic every 2 years.
Yeah, probably won't stay that way.
And while get out the vote mechanics were not that important for Democrats this time, I mean, I think Democrats actually had a pretty good get out the vote effort. It just was irrelevant this time. But the Strama, every cycle has candidate schools and grassroots schools, and brings in kids to go do door knocking and all the rest of it. And who knows what kind of dividends that ended up paying in this cycle. But I've spoken at almost every year when he's got these kids that come in, and that reaches into the district.
McGinnis did produce the iconic attack ad of the cycle in Texas, I think. The jackbooted Obama clones, the Obama Strama ad, really, I think, in a lot of ways. And people ask me, so what's the race really looking like in Texas? I send them to that ad.
And at the state Democratic convention last time, there were 20 lapel buttons that said the Obama Strama ticket.
Right.
I think he's now hunting all of those down and trying to destroy them.
Right. If you have one, he's paying a bounty. Yes.
Right. Buying them back.
I think we're going to call it to a close. Before we leave, I'd be remiss to not say a word for Edmund Kemple, who passed this afternoon. The representative and chairman was a friend of many people up here, and please have his family in your thoughts tonight, if you would. So thank you all for coming very much. There's material about the Tribune, the Texas Politics Project. Please read the work of all our fine guests here: Elise Hu, Gromer Jeffers, Harvey Kronberg at the Quorum Report, Ross Ramsey, and Mr. Jay Root. Thank you all for coming.